LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Dr. Penny Sartori, who joins us to discuss her book, The Transformative Power of Near-Death Experiences, How the Messages of NDEs Positively Impact the World. A near-death experience, or NDE, is a profound psychological event that may occur to a person close to death or in extreme physical or emotional crisis. An NDE may begin with an out-of-body experience, possibly hovering nearby and watching events around the body. An NDE typically includes a sense of moving, often at great speed and usually through a dark space, into a fantastic landscape and encountering beings that may be perceived as sacred figures, deceased family members or friends, or unknown entities. A pinpoint of indescribable light may grow to surround the person in brilliant radiance. Unlike physical light, it is not merely visual, but is sensed as an all-loving presence that many people define as the supreme being of their religious faith. The emotions of an NDE are intense, and most commonly include peace, love, and bliss, although a substantial minority are marked by terror, anxiety, or despair. Most people come away from the experience with an unshakable belief that they have learned something of immeasurable importance about the purpose of life. Overall, the experience is ineffable, and the effects are often so powerful that they create permanent change in people's lives. This phenomenon is as old as humankind itself, and has been documented and explained or dismissed in myriad ways for just as long. In the modern world, dominated by scientific reductionism, NDEs are generally viewed as mere chemical byproducts of a dying brain. The after effects and apparent implications derided as wishful thinking and New Age nonsense. Evidence that NDEs contain a profoundly important message for humanity, however, continues to emerge, and the possibility that they may play a vital part in our evolution is very real indeed. The near-death experience instills knowledge in those who experience it that we are all interconnected, part of a much greater whole, and that what we do to others, we do to ourselves. Hello and welcome, Penny, and thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Hi, Greg. It's lovely to be here.
Today, Penny, we're going to talk about a brand new book that you've co-authored with Kelly Walsh and with contributions from lots of other people. The book's entitled The Transformative Power of Near-Death Experiences, How the Message of NDEs Positively Impact the World. Before we leap into that, just give listeners a little bit of info about your career and your background, your work in general.
Okay, well, I used to work as a nurse in intensive care, and it was early on in my career that I had an encounter with a patient who had quite a suffering and prolonged death, and that sort of made me question what happens when we die. What is death all about? Why do we have to subject patients to such atrocities, really, at the end of their life when we should be helping them to ease gently into death? And I realized that we really don't understand death, and I started reading about death, and then I came across near-death experiences, and I thought, wow, these are really quite interesting, because people are saying that they've died temporarily, and they've had this wonderful experience, and they didn't want to return to life. And although it sounded such a lovely experience, I know my nurse training was very scientific. So I had that bit of skepticism about me, and I thought, well, I don't know really. I'm not sure. It could be that the brain is just shutting down as we approach death. And I thought, well, I'm working in the ideal place where I can research this. And so that's what I decided to do. I undertook my own research study, and I gathered data where I interviewed patients in my care in the intensive care unit for 5 years, and then it took a further 3 years to analyse the data and to write it up. And at the end of it, I was awarded a PhD for the research. And since then, really, my ongoing interest has been the phenomenon of near-death experiences. And I think they're fascinating, and I think there is just so much that we can learn from these experiences.
Now, you've previously written a great deal about near-death experiences and other sort of related areas, shall we say, because the more you get into this, the more you realise what a great overlap there is with some other areas of research and study, particularly psi phenomena in general, the non-material world. So we'll come on to some of the details of that in a moment, but this book is a little bit different what you've done previously because, as I mentioned earlier, you co-authored it with Kelly Walsh. So perhaps you could just tell us, she's not here to speak for herself today, so perhaps you could just tell us just a little bit about her story and then how you came to meet, how this book came into being.
Yes, well, it was in 2014, and my book, The Wisdom of Near-Death Experiences, had not long come out, and I had been inundated by emails from people sharing their experiences. And in fact, I had so many emails that I couldn't respond to them all. And it was in May time, and I was heavily pregnant at the time, and I was due to give birth to my son. And I thought, I can't continue responding to all of these emails, so I really need to take some time off now, maternity time, and really get some rest in preparation for the birth. And so I decided that I wasn't going to respond to the emails. But one came through just as I'd kind of made that decision. And it was a very brief email, and it was from Kelly Walsh, and it said, "Hi Penny, I had a near-death experience a few years ago, and it's guided my future work as a result. Please could we have a chat?" And for some reason, intuitively, I knew that I had to respond to that email. Although it was very brief and didn't give any details of her experience, I just felt that I had to respond. So I replied to her straight away, and we organised a Skype chat, and we chatted the following day. And I was really impressed with Kelly because of what she said. Not only had she had a near-death experience, but it was more the effects of the experience and what she was doing with her life as a result of the experience. So in the book, Kelly describes her experience in full, and basically she had attempted to take her own life through an overdose, and when she was recovering on the psychiatric ward, it was during the late afternoon, the night, and she was holding onto a wooden cross. And she went into some sort of altered state of consciousness, and she felt that she went through 7 bumps of the universe. And during that time where she was kind of out of her body, she was told that like-minded souls would collaborate to change the world. And she had this feeling of deep unconditional love and interconnectivity as well. And as a result of her experience, there's many different things to comment on really about her experience. The first thing is that prior to trying to take her own life, Kelly had suffered greatly all of her life with depression and anxiety and low self-esteem. But now, having had her experience, all of those symptoms have gone. She's no longer depressed, she's no longer anxious, and she no longer has those self-esteem issues. And she is now a very positive person, and to the point that she's actually created a character called Positivity Princess, and it's to empower young children. And her vision for this character as well is about having an animated character, so there's a cartoon that children can watch, so it can empower them from a young age. And her ideas are absolutely amazing, and she patented all these ideas as well. And I was thinking, well, that's incredible, she's got a business mind as well. But what her intention is to create something, and all of this money goes into a charity, which then funds different projects of young children all around the world. And that is exactly what is driving Kelly, to make a difference in the world. And so whereas she could have, made millions of her own, she is has decided that what she wants to work about is for the greater good of mankind, and all of the money that the charity can generate through what she's done by patenting these children's characters, then that can go into the foundation so that it can do good in the world. And I just thought that is just such a wonderful thing to do, and it's just such a vision as well. So that was one of the things that really kind of drew me to Kelly. And when we Skyped as well, you know, she came up with the idea for this book, and she suggested that the royalties for the book go towards charity as well. So it's what is on her mind is how she can serve and how she can make that difference in the world.
Yeah, well, you touched upon some of the key aspects of the near-death experience, the experience itself and also the aftermath. We'll come back to that in a second, but you just put a thought in my head when you were talking about children there, and I think that in general, we often do a great disservice to the younger generation by a certain amount of dishonesty about death, or just refusal to discuss it. You can do more than something like granddad's gone to heaven. That's fine up to a point, but you don't have to say, you know, so-and-so's dead, they're not coming back, get used to it. It doesn't have to be harsh or unfeeling, but I just think if we were a little bit more honest throughout life, then certainly as adults we'd be better able to deal with death, because it's just one of the great taboos, isn't it? And I think that lifelong hiding away from death and denial of death leaves us in rather poor shape when we ourselves come to face it.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, this is a discussion I had today when I was teaching my class, and we were talking about how we shield children from death, and we think that perhaps we're protecting them, where in fact we're perhaps making it more of a difficult thing for them to understand. And I think, you know, children are really quite receptive to these things anyway. And if you look at years ago, before hospitals, you know, and how the deathbed scene was something that was at home, and it was participated in by everyone really, all of the family, the neighbours, the local community. Everyone came to visit the person who was on their deathbed, and it was very much a part of growing up for children as well, and children were there at the deathbed, sitting on the on the bed of the person who was dying. So it's almost as if, you know, in modern times we've kind of lost that connection that we had with death, and consequently, yes, children, I think it is very difficult for them to understand, because we tend not to talk about it openly. It is that taboo subject.
And of course, and this is very much where the near-death experience comes in to teach us something, is that certainly the Western, you know, scientific paradigm is viewing an afterlife as a sort of, you know, fanciful artifact of the religious minded. And if we tell ourselves constantly that after death there's a black void of nothingness, well, that's pretty terrifying to contemplate. It's no wonder that actually sometimes religious people do have more of a balance and are better able to process death, because even if someone, you know, an atheist might turn around and say, oh, well, it's just pure fantasy. The point is, if they believe it, then that has an actual effect.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, it's funny because kind of, if just one or two people kind of describe this experience, but what we're finding is that there's studies now done in hospices where nurses and physicians at the bedside of patients have been interviewed about what they've witnessed. And, you know, this is something that is widely recognized by healthcare professionals, you know. They witness people as they're approaching death on their deathbed. They're communicating with people that we can't see. They talk in symbolic language. They talk about packing their bags, about going on a journey, or waiting for their train to come into the station. There's lots of things like that. And so if it was just one or two people describing this, it wouldn't have much impact. But the fact that there's studies being done all over the world now, and they're all collectively saying very similar things, it goes on to suggest that, you know, the process of death is something far more than what we give credit for. Collectively, when these experiences happen, you know, it has more of an impact, and perhaps it's not just the case of people hallucinating, but perhaps they are entering some other kind of reality that we can't perceive in our normal waking state.
Now, in my recorded introduction to the show, I set out the essential basics of what a near-death experience entails. I know they're all unique, but as you point out, they've got commonalities, so we don't need to actually look at a definition. but we've touched upon some of these key aspects of it and the effects during the experience and after. And I think you mentioned the unconditional love that Kelly experienced. That seems to be like a universal thing. Although there can be some fear and some negative encounters in near-death experiences, this overwhelming unconditional love seems to be, in fact, love unlike anyone who's experienced it has ever experienced on Earth. It just seems to be something else. Then there's the idea of a life review. You know, the old cliche, your life flashes before you. And when in the experience, this sense of timelessness. Now, I'll come back to that later in more depth because there's some very profound possible scientific and philosophical implications in there. And then afterwards, this general sense of empathy, that unconditional love, extending that to other people, as in Kelly's case, wanting to help people and losing their fear of death, actually, if they ever had it. And most of people do to some extent or other. I think those are some of the key aspects, really. It's truly transformative, just to borrow a word from the title of the book.
Oh, yes, it is. These experiences really are transformative, and, you know, certainly when they have this feeling of deep unconditional love, you know, it's beyond anything else that they've ever experienced. And something happens to them during this experience, because when they come back, you know, they are transformed. And that is what is intriguing to me. Is there some sort of way that we could replicate what the people are experiencing subjectively? And then if we could replicate it, you know, if we could develop this into some sort of therapy for people who are undergoing serious depression and anxiety, as Kelly once was. You know, if there was a drug available, I don't know, in fact, I don't know of any drug that has had the effect of this experience that Kelly had, you know. That experience has totally transformed her anxiety and depression into something of great positivity. Now, if there was a drug that had that effect, it would be hailed as a wonder drug. So why aren't people more interested and intrigued by these after effects of these experiences? You know, I think the tendency of these experiences is, oh, we can't explain them, or they must just be a hallucination, or because we can't explain them, let's not look at them any further. But I think, you know, this is something we should be excited about. They have real life-transforming effects. And I think if we had a deeper understanding of these, there are far more potential therapies that we could develop that would be of great benefit to other people as well.
In my experience, my personal experience, and in reading about it and discussing this with many other people, the closest I could potentially offer to that would be the psychedelic drug experience at its most positive, and is by no means always positive, in terms of seeing the world as it is, which is fundamentally connected, feeling a sense of timelessness. That is to say that time and space as we understand them are illusory, or at least they're not a complete picture of reality. And this sense of oneness, as I mentioned, to extend from the idea of connectivity, oneness with everything. But again, that's not, I mean, I know Rick Strassman, I don't know if you've read any of his work. He's a medical doctor who's conducted trials with DMT, but his results were that some people had transformative experiences, having, ingested DMT, but these tended to fade with time, and they weren't always transformative by any means. And I know that the effects of the near-death experience can fade with time. But yes, I think I'm basically trying to offer some other food for thought, but also saying you're absolutely correct. There is nothing else quite like this.
Yeah, that's right. And yes, there are a lot of similarities with psychedelic drugs like the LSD and DMT. And there's been lots of interesting studies as well. And I think it was one back in the 60s by Masters and Houston, I think. I can remember reading their book, Variety of Psychedelic Experiences. And again, they said that, yes, people who'd had these drug experiences were changed, but they rarely, those changes didn't last so long. And, some people procrastinated about going to change, but they didn't actually put those changes into practice. Whereas if you compare that with the near-death experience, the changes are long-lasting, although they can fade with time, you're quite right. But also, people don't procrastinate about what they're going to do. They actually do it. They put it into action, which is one of the things that had impressed me about Kelly, you know. She said, oh, look, I've got these ideas for a positivity princess, and she could be this children's hero character. And she said, I've already patented this so that I can do this and I can do that, and my vision is this, this and this. So she was already acting on it, and she was just full of that good intention as well.
Yeah, I mentioned briefly this feeling of timelessness that near-death experiencers report. I think this is one area of particular interest to me, because I think what cutting-edge science is indicating is not only the fundamental connectedness of all reality, but that, as I mentioned earlier, this linear time that you and I experience in our waking lives, that sense of the passing of time isn't fundamental when you get right down to it. It's almost like something that we use to operate in this 3D reality. Ditto with space. And in many ways, the near-death experience confirms, or seems to suggest rather, that what we actually experience as ultimate reality is actually like some kind of little temporary bubble of strangeness that doesn't really operate on fundamental principles. And it's got these little quirks, like a bit of past and a future and this, that and the other thing that are very, very limiting. But that's what this reality is about, this little reality bubble. But beyond that, there's this this is actually the ground of reality. And the cutting edge science and the near-death experience suggests that possibly that this is consciousness itself is the ground of reality.
Yes, and I would kind of agree with that as well, as a result of the kind of conclusions I've come to through my research. But that's a good point about the time, because those time and space just don't exist during the experience. And if you think about it, some of these people are literally unconscious for a matter of seconds, yet what they experience would take a number of days to kind of get through in real life experience. So, it's fascinating how in a matter of seconds someone can have such a clear, detailed, lucid experience that would run on for hours and hours and hours if it was played in real time. So that is quite a fascinating thing, especially when you consider the life review as well. That expression, your life flashes before your eyes in seconds. Well, literally, but it's more than just a flashing before your eyes as well, because these people are reliving aspects of their life in great detail, yet they might only be unconscious for those brief few seconds, but they've relived the whole of their life again. And, it's just a fascinating thing. And it's a bit like dreams as well. Sometimes I can drift off to sleep in the night and I feel like I've been asleep for ages and ages. And I'll look at the clock and perhaps I've only been asleep for like 10, 15 minutes and things like that. There's that altered sense of perception during sleep as well. Forgot to mention this as well, is that one of the after effects of the near-death experience is that many people can't wear a wristwatch anymore after their experience. For some reason, clocks or watches will malfunction in their presence. And that's kind of linked to time as well. So that's quite an interesting little after effect as well.
It is, yeah. Well, I'm unable to wear a watch because they just stopped working. The last time I had a watch was when I was a child, and it didn't work out well. And I didn't buy it; it was given to me, and it was actually one of the early digital watches. So it wasn't a physical mechanism as such. It was a digital thing. What you were saying about dreaming reminded me of a couple of little stories from an interview I did many years ago. One was simply something that I've experienced for a long time, and I still do on a regular basis, actually, which is when I'm asleep, a voice in my head. Sometimes it's an urge, but sometimes it's clearly a voice which says no. And what that means, and then that wakes me up. And then sometimes as little as a few seconds later, my alarm goes off. So what does that tell us about time or consciousness? How is there a voice in my head while I'm asleep which knows that my alarm's about to go off?
Yeah, that's a fascinating thing as well. And is there some sort of physiological mechanism that's kind of coming into play, or is it your subconscious, or is it more than that? Is it consciousness itself communicating in some way? It's really, when you look at things in depth like that, it really kind of opens up many, many questions as well.
The interview during which I recalled that little anecdote, my interviewer was telling me about a story he heard, similar lines, similar to what you were saying about feeling that you've been asleep for a long time and you haven't, and a lot of things happening in a dream state, similar to the life review and the near-death experience, but actually they couldn't possibly have taken place in real time because you'd only been asleep for an hour or something. And he told the story of this guy who was in bed, and he'd gone into, at some point, into dreaming about being part of, I can't remember if it was a French Revolutionary type scenario, but anyway, he lived an adult life. He had woke up with the experience of having dreamt about an entire life, and at the end of it, he was executed in public by guillotine. And what happened was he was in there having his dream, oh no, things are going bad, I've been sentenced to death. And as he was guillotined in his dream, the headboard on his bed had obviously come loose at some point. It tipped over and hit him on the head and woke him up.
Oh my gosh.
Just as the guillotine was going through his neck.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, so I mean, that could have been a complete coincidence, but still, the fact that he lived in a life in his dream, and he was asleep for an average night, so maybe 6, 7, 8 hours, something like that.
Ah, gosh, that's fascinating. Again, I wonder if in some way he was picking up on that board becoming loose or something like that and entered into the dream state, but it doesn't really kind of compute, does it? You know?
No, it just seems to make no sense whatsoever. Now, a key thing here, we talked about consciousness being potentially the ground of reality. So far, that's kind of looking like a possibility. What might be beyond or below that, we don't know yet. There may be nothing, maybe a lot. As far as the near-death experience is concerned, quite often, this isn't just people who are maybe very ill in hospital. These can be people who have a brush with death, you know, like a violent accident, something like that, you know, a poisoning, you know, maybe they've tried to take their own lives, maybe they've been shot, you know, it can be something really dramatic and violent. So quite often their body can be disabled here, whether through any of those things I just mentioned or through illness, but also their brain sometimes. They can be showing no brain activity. If the body and brain, either or both, disabled during a near-death experience, then where is that consciousness? It's certainly not just floating around in someone's head, is it?
Exactly, and if we consider the current materialist perspective that the brain produces consciousness, well, there is absolutely no explanation for near-death experiences. There should be no conscious experience at all when the brain is flatlined. Yet, people who have a near-death experience during cardiac arrest do report this heightened state of awareness as well. And it's not just, you know, a normal kind of conscious awareness. This is a heightened state of awareness. It's a more sophisticated form of awareness, if you like. And it doesn't compute. If their brain is flatlined, how could it be possible? So, you know, for me, the most logical explanation is to look at consciousness from that different perspective, whereas consciousness is primary and the brain mediates the consciousness rather than produces the consciousness. And I think that, you know, what makes most sense to me and has been alluded to by other researchers is that the brain acts as a sort of filter, and it screens out this kind of heightened state of reality or true consciousness. But there are times in the person's life where that filter action becomes more relaxed. So rather than create an experience, all that's happening is that this heightened state of reality is allowed into that everyday awareness. And so that makes far more sense to me. And I think, you know, that is a good avenue for further research to look at our understanding of consciousness.
Now, in the book, a great deal of it is actually individual chapters by people who've undergone a near-death experience, and they relate that and in particular the after effects. A couple of those were people who had a near-death experience when they were children, and in some cases when they were really too young to actually be able to articulate it in any meaningful way. And it was maybe only later that they really began to consider it or process it or whatever. So there's an issue there. And we can only wonder about children having near-death experiences, again, whether through an accident or illness, and but who do obviously survive later. But, you know, those who've perhaps never spoken about it for, you know, fear of ridicule or whatever. Then there's other people who maybe can't speak. Just as it happens, they cannot speak. You know, they can't communicate in the same way that you and I do. They may have these experiences. Then there may be people who we would class as mentally ill. I mean, there's a horrendous story in the book about this woman who was effectively sectioned after starting to talk about her near-death experience. But there are people who perhaps we'd be better able to label mentally ill or having some kind of mental affliction, not just people who we don't agree with, if you see what I mean. So people who perhaps doctors would agree, say, no, this person does have a diagnosable condition. Here are the following symptoms. People like that, again, may undergo these experiences. And then it got to me to thinking about animals. Animals are conscious. Dogs and cats have a lower level of consciousness, it seems, than human beings, but they're also recognizable consciousness, many similarities. So I do wonder about, I don't know, maybe if other living beings have these sorts of transcendental experiences, maybe they just process them differently because their engagement with reality is different.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And yeah, it could well be that, and I think perhaps when you look at child savants, for example, who perhaps they experience consciousness in a very different way to what we do, and perhaps it's a bit like streaming things from the internet. So perhaps people stream consciousness in different ways, and that makes kind of more sense to me as well. And also, again, when you look at other spiritually transformative experiences, there's something called spiritual emergency as well. And that can often be misdiagnosed as a psychosis. And so, it's because we don't understand these experiences, and hence the need for more understanding with healthcare workers and healthcare professionals. And luckily now, there are big changes, and the Royal College of Psychiatrists have a special interest group in these kind of experiences as well. So we're seeing members of the healthcare profession who are becoming more informed about these experiences as well, which is very encouraging.
And as well as a potentially delayed recall in some of the cases there, I was thinking of, there is the potential for kind of no recall. For example, the point is made in the book that do all who lose consciousness actually have one of these experiences, but we obviously don't hear from everyone in that. Yeah. And I'm not just talking now about people who don't talk about it, but maybe people who don't recall it for whatever reason. So that's an interesting area. It'll be interesting to see where that goes, what the maybe more research and more examination of people's own testimonies might tell us about that possibility in future.
Yeah, that's right. Is there, the people who don't recall having an experience but have had a cardiac arrest, for example, have they in some way suppressed the experience? Or is it just they simply have absolutely no recall of it at all? And, there's one of the chapters in the book is a young man called Ainsley, and he didn't realize he'd had a near-death experience until many years later. And again, I've got another example of another lady who had contacted me, and she was attacked in her home, and she remembers losing consciousness and then waking up in the hospital. But then 6 months later, during the attack, she'd had her nose broken, so she had to go back into hospital to have more surgery to correct her nose. And as she went under anaesthetic, she suddenly found herself back in that scenario where she was being attacked. And this time when she lost consciousness, she went through that tunnel and she went on to recall a near-death experience. So is it that people do have the experience but simply don't recall it? So I think that's another really good potential avenue for further research as well.
When you begin to read about near-death experiences and the character of them, one thing that's very striking is the parallels between those who claim to have had contact with spirits or with the dead. That's not just, nameless spirits, but people who did once exist in this world and then since moved on. Just all sorts of aspects of that and overlap is there. And also with the notions of heaven that you find in biblical texts, and lots of other spiritual traditions talking about, an afterlife or, a realm where we come from into this world and where we return to afterwards. That's fascinating in itself because these are, clearly these people having the near-death experience are not making this up. You point out all the similarities, but it's just fascinating that the overlaps and the parallels with these other traditions and ideas and portrayals of a life beyond this one.
Yes, absolutely. And not only are there the very pleasant experiences, but there are also the distressing kind of experiences as well. And, not all of them are pleasant. Some people do get distressed by their experience. These are more difficult to research because people are more reluctant to talk about these as well, and also they feel some sort of stigma, and it's like, what's wrong with me? Why didn't I have one of these pleasant experiences? Why was I frightened by my experience? And the first kind is the usual sort of near-death experience, but it's interpreted in a very frightening way. And then the second kind is the void experience, where someone can find themselves in this black, meaningless, eternal void. And then the third experience is a hellish type experience, where people can actually feel themselves being dragged down by demons and things like that. And that can be really, really terrifying for the people, and it can leave some people with a degree of post-traumatic stress as well, which again is so important that we get to understand on a deeper level so that we're able to support people as they're recovering from these experiences.
Yes, I think the figure quoted in the book is the void experience can affect up to 50% of people having a near-death experience. And also the phrase, I'm quoting here, the phrase shadow beings also comes out of one of the personal stories in the book, because this person encountered what she described as shadow beings, and that wasn't pleasant at all. She felt she was being pulled apart or taken piece by piece by these things. All of that actually has overlaps with the aforementioned psychedelic experience. Also with not the NDE, but the OBE, the out-of-body experience, which people can just have spontaneously. And there's also people who I've interviewed who say they can induce these. That seems logical enough, with practice, basically.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about the different types of experience here is I remember speculating once in an interview talking about an afterlife. And I was saying, well, maybe part of the afterlife experience is based on our expectations, because there's a lot of evidence that suggests in life in general how we approach things, what our outlook is, what our expectations are, seem to have a small but measurable effect on outcomes. So I remember saying, maybe Richard Dawkins, if he thinks that the afterlife is a black void of nothingness, well, maybe that's what he'll experience. And if someone else believes it's floating around on clouds with their previously deceased relatives, maybe that's what they'll experience. Who knows what processes might come into play here. And I was reminded of that when I started thinking about these different experiences.
Yeah, that's a really good point, in fact. And yes, that is definitely a possibility. And it's not only our conscious expectations as well, it's also our subconscious expectations. Sometimes, they could come into play as well. We don't even realize that we've got stuff in our subconscious sometimes. So perhaps they come through in the experience as well. I
mentioned just a moment ago the out-of-body experience. Taken in tandem with the near-death experience and psychic phenomena in general, I'm talking now about everything from telepathy to telekinesis to what gets called prophecy. Basically, I think that they're all, in some ways, aspects of a wider reality. I think they're all telling us something, and in their own way, they're all giving us a piece of the same puzzle. I think if there's anything to these different psychic phenomena that have been measured in laboratory conditions, for example, like remote viewing, very difficult to replicate, but it's scientifically verified, as quite a lot of other psi phenomena are, but again, difficult to replicate and just have on demand. They're telling us something, and I think that to me, it suggests that, as I mentioned earlier, the way we have reality is back to front. We're here, you and I tonight, thinking that, well, perhaps we don't think this so much, but a lot of us are here thinking this is the ultimate reality, and all this other weird stuff, there might be something to it, but it's on the fringe, whereas it appears to be almost like what this fringe stuff is actually a wider part of a wider reality. And what we're living in, as you alluded to earlier, is actually a very restricted bandwidth of possibility and phenomena that are only giving us a tiny little picture. Yeah,
I would agree with that, yes. And that's kind of one of the conclusions I've come to as a result of studying these experiences for so many years. It's the thing that makes most sense to me. Maybe in a few years' time there'll be something else that will make more sense to me, but currently that certainly does make a lot of sense, yes.
Yeah, and I think that the other stuff that I alluded to, when I say cutting edge science, I'm usually referring to quantum physics, quantum mechanics and all we've been learning there, because it's really a new paradigm of reality that's come along that even makes Einstein look out of date. timelessness I mentioned earlier, the fact that the material is not actually the real, as it were, and the sense of that flexibility of time, or that non-existence of linear time as we think of it, meaning that, again, what the science is suggesting is that the past and future are all accessible. It's almost like everything exists at once, as it were. There isn't a distinct past moving along a trajectory to the future. I just think it's very exciting what the cutting edge science is, how it's tying in with the near death experience. And I just wish sometimes people were talking to each other more in these areas, because we have a very atomized world at the minute, don't we? A lot of specialists, particularly when it comes to science, particularly when it comes to medicine. And there are good reasons why you want a specialist in medicine. If you've got a brain injury, you want a brain specialist on that. But just in terms of a holistic picture, I think we could, a lot of big conversations would serve us well. And of course, I think that's what you're trying to do. Yeah,
that's it. It's collaboration that's going to really take these things further forward. So if we could collaborate with more people or scientists of all different kind of disciplines, so that we all collectively come up with something, And it would be great to work as part of a team rather than in isolation as well. And so you get different kind of expertise from all different fields and put that expertise into one pot, so we can really take this work forward.
Now, we mentioned earlier that however profound the effects of a near-death experience, the deep connections that people experience during them can dissipate with time. Now, and Kelly is a great example of the best outcome, really, you can hope for with one of these experiences. But you talk about the ripple effects of the near-death experience in the book, and certainly this is something that, having read you guys' book just recently, I just finished that a couple of days ago, that instilled in me a kind of a fresh sense of optimism and excitement about the reality that we're part of, and that, that ultimately it's a positive thing, and about the possibility of, I don't need the idea of an afterlife in order to give meaning to this life, but it's really like having a booster. It's like a reboot for your consciousness. And the last time it happened was when I read Lessons from the Light, which is another great book, and it was so inspiring to read. And I think this is obviously one of your hopes as well, isn't it? That you don't have to have a near-death experience to be able to take on board, enact changes in your life to improve things.
Absolutely. And that book you just mentioned, Lessons from the Light by Kenneth Ring, that in that book he talks about the effects of near-death experiences and how he's likened the near-death experience to a benign virus, because once you kind of engage with these experiences, you can get really hooked on them, and that they can really inspire you, and you can be changed through engaging with these experiences. And I know that, when he did a brief survey with the students that he used to teach in the University of Connecticut, and he found that his students were changed in many of the ways that people who've had a near-death experience are, and that was simply through studying the experience, And certainly that's true in my life. Since engaging with near-death experiences, it has really changed me in many ways, and I feel like I've had a spiritual transformation as a result of undertaking my research. It's completely given me a different outlook on life. And I think if we can start to engage people on a wider level, on a wider scale, that more and more people will become engaged with these experiences, because I've seen attitudes change towards near-death experiences. When I started researching them, it was very difficult to find someone who would chat with me face-to-face about the experience. And then gradually, over the years, I found more and more people. Of course, I came across the ones in my hospital research as well. But then, back in 2006, I think it was, there was an article in the local newspaper, and then into the national newspaper, and they put my email address in that, and I had about 600 emails straight away from people. And now, since my last book, The Wisdom of Near-Death Experience, I've got over 14,000 emails. I'm overwhelmed by them, and I can't respond to them. And that's about people who want to share their experience. So I think the more people are hearing about the experiences, the more people are encouraged to talk about their own experience, and then more people are beginning to engage with these experiences as well. So I think it's really, really encouraging, because, you know, the ultimate message of these experiences is one of love, peace and respect. And it's about doing unto others as you would wish to have done unto yourself. And what a lovely way if everyone behaved in that way, you know.
One other parallel I was struck by reading about near-death experiences was how not only similarities, I'd say, with the out-of-body experience and other effects, but how certain people had reached a kind of existential crisis in their lives, had some form of psychotic break or breakdown, and become transformed in quite a similar way. Now, some people have some kind of breakdown and they're just lost. You don't see, they're gone. It affects them badly and they never really recover from it. They're transformed in all the wrong ways. And I was thinking about someone like Eckhart Tolle, who's very famous in the world of spirituality and consciousness. And anyone who's read his story will know he came to the point of suicide, to the point where he just could not take life anymore. Something flipped in that man's brain and he just virtually became a different person, for the better, because he couldn't go on living the way he did. But many of the things that he espouses are actually quite similar to some people who've had a near-death experience, how they come back feeling that certain things that they want to do to help people, and to say, actually, it's not what you think, it's this, it's okay. Even someone like David Icke, another famous person on the alternative scene. Now, he's a controversial character. A lot of people do not like what he is saying. But the reason I mention it is because he had a comfortable, safe life and something flipped inside him. And suddenly everything about who he was and what he wanted to do, needed to do, was going to do, changed. I wonder where all this is leading is that, thinking of the quote from Bernie Siegel in your book, and his quote was, "We unconsciously create a schedule for the future." I got to thinking, do some people have a near-death experience that their consciousness, subconscious, whatever it happens to be, has engineered for them when the time has come when something needs to change? Now, it's a pretty wild suggestion, but that thought occurred to me, you know.
Gosh, yeah, that is it's certainly a possibility, and I don't think, I'd be able to answer it at this stage, but that is certainly, something to throw out there as well. And perhaps people who have had the experiences, perhaps it's depending on the circumstances, some might say, no way, I would never have agreed to have done this. But some might say, okay, well, perhaps it does make sense to me. So I don't know, but that is an interesting concept, certainly.
Yeah, well, I say something to think about in the future, especially if some evidence for it started to emerge. One thing I wanted to bring up with you is this book is fairly fresh. It's a lot of people's personal stories. Sometimes books can take years to come to fruition, but this is quite a fast turnaround. But what has changed really in the near-death experience and your understanding of it from your experience since you started, and what might some of the more recent developments be? If somebody said to you, I'm very familiar with your work, Penny. What's new? I haven't seen you for a year. What's the latest? And perhaps the deeper dimensions of this might be.
Well, I think this could be something as part of our evolutionary process as well, because if you look at near-death experiences and the after effects, very often people are more altruistic and more loving towards others. And of course that has implications on the individual level. So when you're being nice to people, you're actually releasing all these great chemicals into your body. You're releasing things like oxytocin and things, which are all conducive to very good health of the individual. But when you're behaving in an altruistic way to other people and you're putting the needs of others before yourself as well, that in itself is, contributing to our evolution as well. And it's interesting because I don't know if you've read the book by Steven Pinker. I think it's called The Better Angels of Our Nature. In that, he talks about how our society is becoming a less violent society. Although, when you read the news and hear some of the atrocious things that are going on, perhaps it doesn't seem like it. But if you take into the view of the whole history, Steven Pinker believes that we're actually becoming less violent. So perhaps we are this is all conducive to our evolution, and perhaps we're evolving to that next level of consciousness as well. So it could be, that our consciousness is developing, but also as human beings, we're becoming more loving and more altruistic, and perhaps peace on earth will be a thing that we can co-create for the future.
You mentioned some of the negative stuff that we see happening around the world. If there's such a thing as a collective near-death experience as a species, if you see what I mean, like whether we could have a shock to the system that would make us all think, well, we came really close there to being wiped out. It's time to change.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because look at where we are. We're literally on that balance point, really, aren't we? And we could either be annihilated or we could progress into a wonderful, peaceful future. And I think, we really need to kind of have that wider perspective and look beyond our individual beings and look at us in the wider perspective as part of a great whole. And if you look at what we're doing to the earth and Mother Nature, we're destroying ourselves, we really are. And we need to take care of ourselves. Look at indigenous cultures and the respect that they have for Mother Nature. We really need to get back into that mode of thought as well. And I think we're on that balance point, and perhaps, yes, we could go either way. And I'm hoping we go into a more positive and peaceful future, and that these experiences will kind of help us get to that level as well. But, we are at a very dangerous point, really, as part of our humanity.
Now, a lot of our evolution as a species has involved differences in our brain. That is to say, left brain versus right brain, and a degree of extreme separation between the two versus more integrated situation. I think, actually, as much as the left and right brain are both important, I think that if you have too much of one, that's not good for us. So I think that's integrating the two of them, and the sort of yin and yang, black and white, male and female type. There's all of these dualities that you find in nature. I think reintegrating the brain would be very important as we go forward. And I think something like the near-death experience may be part of that happening, actually, and that the more integrated brain that some people suggest there's evidence that we had in the past, part of that is actually these psychic abilities, this sensitivity to the non-material, this connection that we have, an unspoken connection. A lot of people working in this area, like Rupert Sheldrake's dogs knowing when their owners are coming home, or before the phone rings, you suddenly think about your aunt ringing, and then your phone rings and it's your aunt, or feeling that something bad has happened to a loved one, just a feeling, and then you find out it's true. I think these are all aspects of the human potential, whether we had it in the past or not. I think going forward that's part of our evolution too.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I think perhaps, we've lost the roots of those things as well, because we've got technology now, so we don't perhaps have to think about the way in which we communicate. Everything is done like that. Whereas before, perhaps we had more time to sort of communicate in different ways. And so I think sometimes it's about getting back in touch with our inner nature as well. And yes, certainly those experiences, yes, they are very common. They're very common for me, certainly. And I used to witness them actually when I was working as a nurse. In fact, another discussion I had in class today was when I worked in intensive care, and I was working on a night shift looking after a young man, and he was becoming very, very distressed. And the aim was to make sure that we could keep his sedation off so that we could fully wake him up in the following morning. And for the whole of the night shift, I was literally couldn't leave this man's bedside. I was talking him through, coming through the sedation. And at one point, he reached a bit of a crisis point, and it was about 4:05 in the morning. And I can remember that several of my colleagues had to assist me to keep him calm. And as soon as that kicked off, the phone went, and it was his mother, and she said, "I know tell me what's happening with him. I can sense something's going on." So we explained the situation, and she came down to the hospital and sat with him, and he was much calmer, and we were able to maintain keeping his sedation off. So that was something, things like that I used to see very regularly in the hospital as well.
Well, speaking about the medical profession, in many ways you would think that anything that contributed towards more understanding of the, human condition, human health, mental and physical, and how these things work together. For example, the placebo effect is widely accepted, but its actual implications are just ignored. That's a good example of the mind-body connection. But you would think that anything along these lines would be welcomed across the board by medical professionals at whatever level. But there seems to be, you've experienced a certain amount of resistance to these things, and certainly good luck going to your GP to talk about near-death experience. In terms of how that pans out, you might just get some medication. What does, in that case, whether individually or collectively, what does the medical profession in general, in your opinion, have to lose by kind of exploring this or beginning to kind of accept the evidence in front of its nose? Because it seems kind of like, well, if it turns out to be nothing, then you haven't lost anything. So I'm just wondering what the resistance is all about.
I know. I just think it's something that they just don't take on board. There's this attitude that they know better, that these are just some sort of hallucinations, and there's absolutely no basis in reality for these experiences. But clearly, these experiences have great effects, and there's so much potential of what could be developed. And I just think it's so frustrating, because for years I've been trying to get these into the education of nurses and doctors, but it's become a real great struggle to try and do it. But there are some changes, the younger doctors coming through, and some of the older ones that I've worked with as well. They certainly, when they understand more about the experience, they have become more open to it. And I was very fortunate where I worked in intensive care. The doctors there all did take these experiences on board, and so they were quite aware of them. And if a patient reported an experience, they told me about it, but they also documented it in the notes as well, which is quite a big breakthrough. And I think, we are going to see changes, and they're perhaps a bit they're not as quick as I would like to see, but there are changes. And certainly with the Royal College of Psychiatrists Special Interest Group and people like that, they're very forward thinking now, and they're very much aware of these experiences. So I think in the future we're going to see big changes.
Yeah, well, maybe a few senior consultants or something will have near-death experiences themselves, and they'll run out down the street shouting about it from the rooftops. But certainly, like a lot of things in human affairs, in history, and in evolution, whether it's of our bodies or whether it's of our minds, you can reach a tipping point. It's difficult to say what that would be, but if acceptance of this phenomena kind of became the norm at some point, whatever majority that would take, you would see huge changes would come very quickly. And as is also pointed out in your book, you don't need the overwhelming majority of a population or a species to adopt something or accept something for it to become kind of unstoppable.
Yes, that's right. And I think, it's gonna, once so many people have got this deeper understanding, it's because people look at it and the surface value of it, they don't connect with it and they don't engage with it, but it's when they engage with it that people become intrigued by these experiences, and that's when attitudes start to change, And I'm fortunate because I teach a course on an adult education in the adult education department, and it's really interesting to see people kind of change their ideas about these things once they start to become educated about them. And the changes it's made on the lives of the students as well is really quite impacting. So it's a really great subject to become involved with, and it's something that we can all be empowered by if we could only all engage with it as well.
Well, Colin Wilson, the late great Colin Wilson, wrote about a colleague of his who was I think it was Abraham Maslow actually, and he was lecturing on peak experiences, and he got to the point with the students where the students were able to self-induce, spontaneously have peak consciousness experiences just by thinking about having them. So it was almost like focusing on this, talking about it, thinking about it started to make it actually happen. So I think there's a lesson for us in there. And I would say there's a nice quote from Bernie Siegel again from the book, "The wiser we get, the better the future will be for those who follow us." So I would just say, a bit like the Sufi tradition suggests that we die before we die, I would just say to anyone listening to this who's intrigued, don't wait until you're dying before looking into this, and if there's changes that you want to make in your life, don't wait.
Yes, absolutely.
So, Penny, today we've been talking about your book, as mentioned at the top of the hour, co-authored with Kelly Walsh, and contributions from lots of people who've undergone near-death experiences. Just to remind people, the title of the book is The Transformative Power of Near-Death Experiences, How the Message of NDEs Positively Impact the World. Now that's out now on Watkins, that's widely available. Before we close off, however, is there like to share maybe your website, Kelly's? I mean, there's a long list of websites in the book, but maybe a couple of the key ones that people should look at first.
Well, there's Kelly Walsh, and that's positivitypowermovement.com. She's also got another website, positivityprincess.com, and kellymichellewalsh.com. One person in the book is Gigi Strela, and she has initiated the near-death-experience-uk.com, and that is like a support group for people who've had a near-death experience. There's also my website as well, www.drpennysartori.com. And at the back of the book there is a list of all of the contributors and all of their websites. And have a look at all of them. You know, there's some great websites there, some great resources as well.
Splendid. Well, Penny, once again, thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Thank you very much, Greg.